Hello and welcome to Town Meeting Television and another in our live candidate debate forums, part of our coverage of election 2020. I'm your host, Matt Kelly. On this episode, candidates for Vermont Attorney General. I'm pleased to be joined on the debate screen by incumbent Democrat TJ Donovan and Republican candidate Brooke Paige.
Hello there.
Gentlemen, welcome to you both. Thank you so much for joining us here today and for your willingness to serve our great state. Our format for today's debate begins with 90-second opening statements, followed by a round-robin question and answer. If you're viewing this live, this is your opportunity to dial in and ask questions directly of our candidates. The number is 862-3966. Again, if you're watching this on our live stream, the number to call in and ask a question directly of either candidate is 862-3966. And so off we go. Time for opening statements. Incumbent Democrat TJ Donovan, will begin with you.
Great. Well, Matt, thank you for hosting this. I really appreciate it. Brooke, good to see you. Thank you for running, and I look forward to a vigorous debate today. I'm running for re-election as Attorney General to continue a common sense and compassionate approach to being the Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the state of Vermont. I've always believed that the best way to enforce the law is to give Vermonters the opportunity to comply with it. That means listening to the Vermonters, that's being accessible to Vermonters, and that means problem solving with Vermonters. As an example of that, that was our response during the COVID-19 crisis. Early on in March and April, when the executive orders were coming out, our job was to enforce them. The last thing I wanted to do was to make criminals out of hard-working, regular Vermonters. So I created a rapid response team to work with Vermonters, to answer their questions, to keep small businesses open, to comply with the governor's executive order so we would promote our public health, but at the same time, give Vermonters that chance to keep a roof over their head, put food on their table, and keep the money coming in. We did this together as a state because that's what we stand for in Vermont. It's also about being responsive, making sure when Vermonters getting ripped off or scammed, like the gentleman down in Rutland who called me, he got ripped off as part of his grandfather's scam. He wrote a check for thousands of dollars. We got on it. We got his money back. Standing up for somebody who was fighting with a mortgage company who said they owed money to the mortgage company when they didn't. We got their money back. It's about fighting for everyday Vermonters. And when the federal government steps back, it's making sure that Vermont steps up to protect everybody's civil rights, to protect our environment, and to make sure that the rule of law is followed and preserved in this great country. That's what my record has been these last 4 years. That's why I'm running again. I ask for your support.
Thank you. Brooke Paige, your response, your opening statement, 90 seconds, please.
Yeah. I'm Brooke Paige, and I'm running this time out for Attorney General and also Secretary of State. I think that TJ Donovan's been doing an adequate job, but my fear is that we don't keep a right enough look at the big picture. I've been involved in a couple lawsuits with the state, and instead of wanting to get to the actual issues, that are at the core of the suits, the Attorney General's office has spent a lot of time running rings around me, and with claims of not having standing and the court not having jurisdiction or venue. And these were not frivolous issues. The most recent one was to try to compel Secretary Condos to abide by Act 92 and Act 135 and distribute the ballots by way of the town clerks, which was specified in both acts. Earlier suit was trying to rein in the consolidation law that had been passed. And the Attorney General's office never allowed those cases to get to the real issues at hand. Additionally, I have concerns that the office fails in its responsibility to actually act as the Attorney General acting as the Chief Law Enforcement Officer for the state. In recent months, as we've heard all of this defund the police and such things that we haven't heard the Attorney General stand up and say, look, law enforcement is important in Vermont. You know, in a small rural state like Vermont, if you don't have the police and you don't have the sheriff's offices, you're basically returning to a state of nature. The Wild West could return to Vermont. I mean, out where I
If you can wrap
live,
up, Brooke, please.
yeah, of course. Out where I live, we're half an hour from any law enforcement. And the joke is, when you call them, you might as well remind them to bring along the body bags and the red tape, because it's about all the good they're going to be able to do for us.
Okay, thank you. Just a reminder to candidates, 90 seconds is our time limit for each response. So if we could try to keep it under that. I try not to interrupt so that the stream of thought stays with each response. Moving right on, Brooke, we'll begin with you with our first round robin Q&A here. What do you think will be different for the people of the state of Vermont if you are elected to this position?
Well, as I've already stated, I hope that they'll see a better concentration on the chief law enforcement aspect of the office, and see better coordination between the law enforcement office organizations in the state, and coordination between the state and surrounding states to try to control various nefarious activities by criminals, not only drugs, but other illegal activity. I hope that that the citizens would also see a broader concentration on making sure that not only are we excited about social justice, but that we continue to be concerned about criminal justice, to make sure that the victims of crimes are being adequately cared for, and that the criminals are not necessarily, being coddled, but are being held responsible for their acts.
90 seconds for your response, TJ Donovan. How do you feel that the people of the state of Vermont have been impacted through your holding this office?
Well, I've always tried to be responsive to Vermonters, Matt, to understand that to hold elected office is not only an honor, but it's a calling, and it's a calling of service to others. And as I tell folks in my office all the time, that no matter the call we get, it may not be the most important call of our day, but I can guarantee you this: it's the most important call of the day for the Vermonter who's making the call, because they're in crisis. They need help. And we have to have that sense of urgency to try to help Vermonters. And that's what I care about: trying to help Vermonters, trying to solve their problems, trying to get the information they need so they can solve their own problems, and to be of service. And this idea of a sense of urgency, of a collective action, that there is a mission of our office, that this is about the greater good, that this is about helping folks, that this doesn't matter about politics when you're talking about the Attorney General's office, but this is about being responsive, being compassionate, and using common sense to help Vermonters solve whatever issue they may have, whether it's with state government or whether it's the mortgage company or a scam, to solve people's problems and to be responsive. That's my record, and that's what I'm going to continue to do.
We'll continue with you, TJ Donovan. You are the chief law enforcement officer in the state. That is the role of the Vermont Attorney General. To what degree do you see the office as responsible for challenging or encouraging change in our law enforcement, whether it be decriminalizing drugs, bail reform, et cetera, et cetera? 90 seconds, please.
Yeah, it's a great question, Matt. Look, the Attorney General is the chief law enforcement officer, and you're a leader in that position, not only on policy, but also on legislation. And that's been my record, whether it has been advocating early on to decriminalize marijuana because of all the collateral consequences it would carry, such as making kids ineligible for federal student loans because they couldn't go to college, leading up to when Governor Scott legalized possession, is saying, hey, you can't tell Vermonters you can legally possess something. Now we got to tell them how they can obtain it legally, to a fully regulated system. to advocating for alternatives to our criminal justice system, to building out diversion programs that we've led across this state. So we now have one standardized system of justice and not 14 different systems of justice in the state of Vermont, that we address the issues of inequality in the access of our justice system, to advocating in the legislature for greater expungement laws so people are not held back by decades old convictions that have nothing to do with public safety anymore, but has just marginalized an entire subset of our population, mostly people of color and mostly the poor in this state. So you are a leader as the Attorney General, not only in policy, not only in practice, but in legislation. That's what I've led on these last 4 years, and I will continue to do it.
Great. Brooke, the same question to you as you had indicated in your previous response. You want to bring back, the law and order aspect, if you will, not just the social justice, but the criminal justice, if you will. How do you view the position as key to changing policy and affecting change, whether, again, it be, as the Attorney General indicated, decriminalizing drugs, expungement in criminal records, et cetera, et cetera. Where do you fall on that advocacy to change policy in this role?
I think the most important aspect, and TJ touched on it already, is that we have uniform application of the law across the state. Right now, there's supposed to be coordination amongst the state's attorneys with the Attorney General's office to try to make sure we have that uniformity. But it's finding that there's quite a variance between one part of the state and another. Likewise, I think we have to be very careful. We hear a lot about that there's racial inequities and other types of inequities across the state as far as the application of the law. And I think the important thing is not to resegregate out different parts of the community, but to just make sure that the law is being equally applied to everyone. One concern that I've had with TJ Donovan's operation of the AG's office is we've learned recently that his office is involved in certain types of advocacy. I know that his office tried to shield this from being discovered by asking a citizen to pony up over $3,000 to get certain email information out. And it wound up that part of the reason for them wanting to keep this less than transparent was that there was quite a bit of advocacy being conducted for Planned Parenthood. And I suspect that if one were to dig into this a little bit, we would find out that Gun Safe and the types of activities that VPRIG supports also has found a welcome home in the AG's office.
Time.
Yeah, to the detriment of the opposing side in those things. And the AG's office should really be a fair.
We'll stay with you, Brooke Paige, here because we've briefly heard each candidate here talk about racial justice, social justice as being one of the core responsibilities here. How do you see the role of this office to address systemic racism? And can you point to examples of systemic racism, and how would your candidacy and your role as Attorney General address them?
As I've already said, my most important concern is to make sure that everyone is being treated equally, to make sure the law is applied equally. As far as there being systemic racism here in Vermont, I worked in Philadelphia for nearly 30 years and commuted back and forth to home here in Vermont. And to be very honest, there was a lot more, I don't want to call it racism, because I would like to think that racism has been on the decline for quite a while, but we're always going to have prejudice in different groups. Since the beginning of time, this has existed. The rich are prejudiced against the poor. Various racial groups are prejudiced against one another. And it's not an all one-way flow that whites are prejudiced against blacks blacks are prejudiced against whites, blacks are prejudiced against Asians, Asians against blacks and white. So these things are going to exist, and there's no way that the government stepping in is somehow going to remediate this social issue. Education and better knowledge of the different people, familiarity is going to be the thing that really resolves this. And so I think making a lot of laws and a lot of rules to try to fight this is really not the answer. The answer is to make sure that everyone is treated equally.
TJ Donovan, the same question to you. What do you see as examples of systemic racism in Vermont society, and how do you feel the office addresses that and, rights historic wrongs?
Sure. We're at an inflection point, not only in Vermont, but in this country, on the issue of race, racism, and racial justice. And I think the first thing we have to acknowledge, Matt, is that racism exists, not only in our country, but in Vermont. And that systemic racism exists in Vermont. And what we have to do, certainly all of us, but in particular, to your question as the chief law enforcement officer, is to first reflect and to understand the role that racism has played, the role white supremacy has played in our nation's founding and in our nation's history, to listen, to learn, and to be willing to challenge ourselves to be part of the solution. And, your question's a good one. And a specific example, I think you have to just look at the criminal justice system. Our jail population should be a reflection of our general population. And you have probably a little less than 2%, I think, of African-Americans living in Vermont. But we have close to 10% in our jails of Black people. And that raises the question of implicit bias. It raises the question of race and racism. It raises the question of fairness. And so one of the things that I've done is to make sure that we start training our prosecutors on this issue of implicit bias. We all have it. And when we talk about race, we have to be willing to get uncomfortable about talking about it. And we have to be willing to challenge ourselves and to learn and to understand about these issues of implicit bias, to make sure that the system is fair, to make sure that everybody receives equal protection under the law. We also have to continue to build out our alternatives to our criminal justice system, to continue to expunge old criminal records and to level the playing field. That's what I've done. That's what I'll continue to do. That's why I'm running for re-election.
TJ Donovan, we'll stay with you here on this question here about partisan politics. The Attorney General office, in many ways, is a nonpartisan position, and as we heard Brooke Paige state earlier, he views that it should be equal treatment under the law. But why is it important that for a nonpartisan position such as Attorney General, we continue to have it be an elected partisan election that decides the candidate?
Yeah, another great question, Matt. And look, I'm a Democrat, and I am proud to be a Democrat. And I'll always be a Democrat. And I think why that matters and what that stands for. Look, I believe that government stands for helping folks, not giving people a handout, but giving a hand up when they need it, and for standing up for folks. That's the role of government, in my opinion. I think those are democratic values. And why it's important that we have the chief law enforcement officer, the attorney general, to be an elected position is because you want the values of this community, of this great state of Vermont, our collective values, to be represented in our legal system, as represented by the Attorney General. As I said earlier, whether it's the issues of policy, whether it's the issue of legislation or litigation, those are all going to be driven by what I value, and my values come from having grown up in this state, understanding what it means to be a Vermonter, understand what it means to help people in need, understanding what it means to fight for folks who don't have a voice. Those values reflect the work I've done as Attorney General, and that's why it's important to have an elected position and to continue to have a Democrat like me in office.
Brooke Paige, elected versus appointed for the Attorney General. Your thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I've spoken out about this numerous times, both on the Attorney General's office and the other statewide offices that seem to have less to do with partisanship: Treasurer's Office, Auditor of Accounts, Secretary of State. And the biggest problem is that if it's not an elected position, then what is it? It's a position that's beholden to whoever selects that person for office. So it would either be, the Attorney General is technically under the executive branch, but to have the governor select the Attorney General, we have the Attorney General beholden to the governor. Likewise, if the legislature were somehow to directly select the Attorney General or these other offices, then they would be beholden to those officials for their job. And so while it's probably not ideal, and maybe it would be better if we had folks run for these offices without having the Democratic, Republican, Libertarian monikers after their names, it's still far better to have them as elected positions than appointed positions.
Great. Brooke, Paige, will continue with you here with questions and answers, part of our debate forum here. A reminder, if you are watching this live on our live stream on YouTube, you're welcome to dial in and ask a question directly of Brooke, Paige, or TJ Donovan. That number to dial is 862-3966. We're in the midst of an unprecedented pandemic within our country and certainly within our state as well. And that presents some increasing challenges with many new rules and regulations. Brooke, how do you envision using the office to help Vermonters navigate their way through this challenging time while staying healthy and meeting their economic commitments?
I'm not sure how directly related to either the Attorney General's office or the Secretary of State's office the control of the COVID-19 virus is. A good example.
Well, if I can, I'm going to inject with you here and you can continue with the 90 seconds. It's specific to the rules and regulations that have been put forth under a state of emergency through the governor. How do you envision, balancing those two concerns, the unprecedented times that we're in and the civil liberties of Vermonters? 90 seconds, Brooke.
My greatest concern in all of this has been the overreach of the government into people's lives. It's one thing to lay out for the citizens the exists and suggest those things that they can do to ameliorate the concerns. But it's quite another to be having a telephone snitch line or to be going out and indicting a business owner in Rutland because he's just trying to figure out some way to survive. And so I think all of this mandated masks and all of this would be far better handled and far better received if it were merely suggestions from the health department and from the governor suggesting social distancing might be best, suggesting that reduction in capacity at nursing homes or restaurants or hotels would be a good idea. But when we go beyond and start to interfere in people's lives and livelihoods, it's a real problem. If the state wishes to do this, then my thought is that the state then acquires the responsibility for making people whole for having damaged their lives. And this is a real problem. And it's one that the state does not have the resources to financially tend to.
Time. Thank you, Brooke. TJ Donovan, the question to you as well. Unprecedented times have required unprecedented responsibilities and some would say a relaxation of civil liberties. How do you view the role of an attorney general in balancing those two, the response of the state and the civil liberties of its citizens?
Well, Matt, I view it the way I've done it, which is to utilize common sense, which is to utilize compassion, which is to work collaboratively with Vermonters to not only comply with the governor's executive orders, so we can promote our collective public health. We are in a pandemic, but at the same time, work with Vermonters so they can keep their businesses open, keep a roof over their head, and put food on their table. And that's my record. Look, this job is you're the chief law enforcement officer. You have the authority to enforce the law, but you have the discretion to figure out and decide how do you enforce the law. And how I've done it throughout my career is to believe in Vermonters, to believe in the goodness of people, and to understand that sometimes the best way to enforce the law is to give people the opportunity to comply with it. That means talking with folks. Hey, look, we all remember March and April. It was scary. It was confusing. We had a lot of orders coming out, but as I said, I created this rapid response team, took hundreds of calls from Vermonters, worked with folks to, again, satisfy those twin objectives, not only compliance with the governor's executive order to promote our public health, which worked, our numbers are incredibly low, but also to work with businesses where we could so they could keep their doors open, so we could keep our economy running. I think we did it pretty well in Vermont. I'm proud of my team's effort. I'm proud of the restraint that, frankly, we exercised. And I think at the end of the day, when I talk about being a prosecutor, the most important quality of a good prosecutor is restraint and trust. And that's what I've demonstrated not only these last 6 months, but during the entirety of my career.
Well, gentlemen, we've come to the end of our debate forum. 30 minutes goes very quickly. It's time for closing comments. And Brooke, Paige, we'll begin with you. 90 seconds to sum up your candidacy and your closing statements.
Well, you've learned a little bit from our interchange, and that you have a sense of what I intend to do if I'm fortunate enough to be elected as the state's next Attorney General, to provide and distribute the law equitably and fairly, to make sure that everyone is treated equally, and that the Attorney General's office does not provide special preference to any group whatsoever, that I would intend to make the laws are enforced fairly, that not only are the perpetrators treated fairly, but also that the victims are treated fairly, that the office is able to coordinate with the various law enforcement agencies throughout the state and throughout the region to make sure that we have a safe environment in which to raise our families and to live our lives.
Very good. Brooke, Paige, thank you so much. TJ Donovan, 90 seconds for your closing statement.
Well, Matt, thank you, and Channel 17 for hosting this debate. Brooke, thank you for participating. Thanks for running. It's good to see you. Look, I'm running for re-election to continue to bring about a common sense and compassionate approach as Vermont's Attorney General, to make sure that people have the opportunity to get ahead when there's a problem arising with a question about our laws, our rules, our regulations, by working collaboratively, being creative and problem solving, and believing in the goodness of Vermonters. As I've said, the best way to enforce the law is to give folks the opportunity to comply with it, to help our small businesses, to protect our consumers, to protect people who are getting ripped off from scams, to be responsive and have that sense of urgency that a Vermonter's problem is our problem and we're going to work together to solve it. And when the federal government steps back to stand up and protect people's civil rights, our environment, and to preserve and promote the rule of law, this is a unquestionably difficult time in our nation's history. As Attorney General, I've been there, I've fought for you, I have your back, and that's what I'm going to continue to do as your Attorney General. I ask for your vote for Attorney General on November the 3rd. Thank you.
My thanks to both Brooke Paige and TJ Donovan for joining us here this afternoon. Both candidates have done the hard work. They are running for office. Now all you have to do is vote. Show up at the polls on Tuesday, November 3rd, or a reminder that early voting has already begun here in our great state. Check your local mailbox for your local ballot. Complete the ballot and return the ballot before the deadline. And then join us for all election night results beginning at 7 p.m. here on Town Meeting Television. I'm Matt Kelly. Thank you for watching.